Live to dissect it all. Political reporters Amanda Kopp with Community Radio Australia and also Matthew Killoran with News Corp Australia. Thanks both for your time. Community Radio Network. I nearly got it.
Almost.
Look, it's all been about the RBA, the economy, endless hot takes on Phil Lowe, of course, from journalists, from plenty of politicians as well. What have you made of it all, and I guess where the economy's headed? Because Labor just sort of watches all this and says, can we still get a soft landing? It seems increasingly less likely.
Yeah, we even heard just this morning that Phil Lowe is saying the soft landing is possible, but that path is narrower and the chances of being knocked off it have increased. He's also admitted that there's a chance he's gone too far when it comes to interest rate rises. He's saying could have gone too far and we're going to, enter a recession. Or on the flip side, he's also warning he may not have gone far enough and we're going to have entrenched inflation. So essentially, trying to guide the economy is about akin to hitting a target by throwing a live bee at it.
Descriptive as ever. The interesting part around Labor's reaction is they've got a budget coming up. And Jim Chalmers went from sort of saying, look, we realise that these are austere times, to an interesting comment he said this week around the October budget, well, inflation peak was ahead of us. By the next budget, it will be behind us, indicating the spending restraint might have reduced a bit, which, it's sort of interesting because inflation will still be very high compared to normal standards during that budget. So surely it's not a big spending budget.
Yeah, I think the thing that is interesting is that we're looking at inflation like, we've got to get it down as fast as possible, but it looks like it's going to be high for a number of years. We're looking at reducing it fairly slowly over time, so there's not kind of a big shock to the system. And how Labor sort of handles the budget in terms of spending is, I guess we'll find out in a couple of months. But one thing that the Reserve Bank Governor did say this morning was that it was a good thing that Labor was banking some of the high terms of trade of what we're getting for coal and iron ore, rather than spending that. So that is money coming out of the economy rather than going into it and increasing inflation.
So far most has been banked, so I guess that'll be the test, that if they pull back from most, then you can bet the coalition will seize on it all. And it's this strange situation in which we're kind of hoping that spending's soft and the economy slows, and even the stock market went up when our unemployment went up, because everyone wants to see the signs that what the RBA is doing is working, and then maybe we might avoid recession. So it's weird what's being barracked for at the moment in terms of the economy.
It's unusual times, and essentially ever since since COVID, the expected behaviour of the economy has altered from what we've previously seen. So it's been hard to predict what's working, even though we've had two successive rises in the unemployment rate so far. We're still at largely historic lows. Full unemployment's previously been around 4.5% to 5%, and we've been at a sustained level of unemployment with a 3 in front of it. So, as unusual as it is to say, it's not a terrible sign for the economy if we do have this slight uptick in the unemployment that we've seen so far.
Yeah, no one's panicking when it hits 3.7, are they? Voice has been interesting. Development today. Peter Dutton is predicting it might not pass. I don't think it'll shock people, but it's interesting that he sort of wants to be at the forefront of that prediction, and how much the Liberal Party might be a part of saying that it shouldn't pass. Where do you see this? Where do you see the Liberal Party going, I guess, on this? Is his prediction right?
Well, look, if I'm going to be honest, from conversations that I have had with many people, people do seem to want to talk about the voice. I think that there is something to what Peter Dutton is saying in terms of the doubt in the community about what the voice will actually mean. I think an interesting distinction that has come through, at least from my conversations, either in this building or outside the building, is that people seem to be extremely on board with constitutional recognition, that would sort of, no one seems to have. I don't think I've talked to anyone who has a problem with that. But when it comes to the voice, that's where people start getting more confused. And it might be this thing that Peter Dutton keeps on saying, which is that there aren't as many details. And I think that, Anthony Albanese has sort of gotten himself in a tricky position, because the voice isn't going to look the same in 10 years' time or 20 years' time or 50 years' time, because it's going to change over time.
It's set by Parliament.
Yeah, and so it's hard to say, OK, here are the details of what Labor wants the voice to look like, but what happens in 50 years? It might be totally different.
But he could still say, this is something this Parliament will enact, so here's a draft bill. I don't think we're going to see that, are we? Unless he thought it was in a lot of trouble and then he might change his mind on that. Is that
I think that's fairly safe to say. The Prime Minister has stored a lot of his political capital in getting this through. So if he doesn't get through, it's gonna cost him. So he's going to do his best to try and to pass it through as it is. He's not going to want to release a draft copy of this legislation, because essentially what you're voting for, as Amanda was saying, what you're voting for at the election isn't this specific model of the voice. It's about the right for Indigenous people to have that voice at the table.
Better get to the Olympics. You've been Queensland based. It's all about Brisbane coming up. But for me, it's all about, we've got this stadium deal. The Gabba's going to be redeveloped and a new stadium will be built. What about the tenants of the Gabba? Of course, I'm concerned about the Brisbane Lions, but there's the heat, there's Ashes test and so on. We don't yet know what happens when the Gabba's getting reconstructed.
No, it's a little bit unclear at this stage. There's a few ideas that have been sort of thrown out there, such as the RNA showgrounds, but at the end of the day, yes, we've got the funding locked in, but the Department of Infrastructure Secretary Jim Betts made it clear earlier in the week that what these funding discussions are, they're high-level scope. They're not getting down to that nitty-gritty. So we're going to have to wait a little bit longer before we find out what happens to the tenants of the Gabba, and possibly more important, whether we can get the construction done between 2025 and 2029 so we don't have any disruption to the Ashes.
Takes a long time these days. You're concerned about the Ashes. I'm concerned about the Lions. It's funny just to reflect on this, because before Sydney it was just the biggest thing in town, and now every time it comes up you go, oh, that's right, Brisbane have the games. But it's still going to be a big event, and not the big spending one they used to be. We don't have the same budgets, and Olympics just don't get the same money spent on them, I guess. Yeah,
well, look, I don't want to talk about how young I was when the 2000 Olympics happened. So in terms of the political spending around that, I probably wasn't quite aware of it at that point. But as far as I know, before I came on this, I called some Queensland friends to say, what's this Gabba spending? And it sounds like the Gabba has been waiting for an upgrade for a very, very long time, and that there are problems where particular games don't get played there because it's not really necessarily up to scratch. So I mean, the classic thing with Olympic funding is that it's not just for the Olympics; it's a long-term investment in the entertainment and sports space for a particular city.
Yeah, the Gabba will certainly be used a lot. Homebush was built for Sydney, of course, but I think stadia were a bit cheaper back then.